Are you bored, tired, lonely, stressed, anxious, or emotional? And if so, do you feel like you are constantly hungry? Well, here's the thing, you don't have to be physically hungry to be hungry. There's this little hunger that I like to call fake hunger. And more often than not, that hunger can stem from the fact that you're bored, lonely, tired, emotional, stressed, anxious, etc. And the moment you feel one of those feelings, you then become hungry. But it's not a physical hunger where your tummy actually grumbles. It is a hunger that has potentially become very habitual over the years because you've used food as a coping mechanism to get through any of those feelings. Eating when you're bored could also very well be habitual. And if you're constantly going to be turning to food when you are on your health and fat loss expedition, that might not necessarily align with your calorie goals. Over the years, you may have used food as a coping mechanism to deal with moments that you're a little bit more stressed, a little bit more anxious, or a little bit more emotional. And over the years, you may have also created a habit to eat when you are bored. And if you are on a health and fat loss expedition, you are going to have to tweak those habits or those coping mechanisms so that you can adhere to your calorie deficit goals so that you can see fat loss progress. So how do you tackle this fake hunger that I speak of? Firstly, with difficulty. Let's just call a spade there. It's not going to be an easy process. It is a difficult process, but you have to be willing to tackle it. Number one, I want you to find the root cause of the problem. And this is the very important step that most people overlook. Let's use an example. Eating when you are stressed is like putting a band-aid on a wound that needs stitches. It might work for a brief second or two, but it's not a long-term solution to the root cause of the problem. And this is why you need to find out what the root cause of these emotions are, so that you can actually tackle it head on and not constantly be looking for coping mechanisms that are food. An awesome little strategy that I like to use with any of my private coaching community members is called the if-then strategy. And what that means is if you get stressed, then you will do X, Y, or Z. Let's break that down a little bit further. This is potentially what is currently happening with you. If you get stressed, then you will turn to food as a coping mechanism. Now what you need to do is replace that then, so you no longer turn to food as a coping mechanism. The new coping mechanism could look something like this. If I get stressed, then I will go for a walk. Or if I get stressed, then I will phone a friend. Or if I get stressed, then I'll wait it out for 20 minutes before I act upon that feeling of hunger. What I want you to do there is figure out some other thens that you can turn to if that fake hunger hits. So instead of immediately turning to food, you are now armed with a list of different thens, of different coping mechanisms, of different strategies that's going to help you get through that moment without turning to food as a coping mechanism. Essentially, at the end of the day, you want to create a gap between the if and the then. The reason for that is you want to give yourself time to process the thoughts, to make calculated decisions, and not to act immediately upon that. The only way for this if-then strategy to work is if you actually write down several different thens. So several different things, habits, actions that you can see yourself doing instead of turning to food as a coping mechanism when that fake hunger hits. So if you're serious about this, what I would suggest that you do is get a pen, get a piece of paper, and write down your current trigger points. If this happens, then you turn to food. Now you've identified your trigger points. Now write down several different thens. So several different actions or behaviors that you will partake in before turning to food as a coping mechanism. But again, the only way a strategy like this can work is if you are willing to make it work. And if you are willing to put the groundwork in and the homework in to identify your trigger points and the actions that you want to turn to. It's the same with any fat loss strategies. You cannot just sit there and expect them to work if you don't actively start putting the work in. So here's what you're going to do. You're going to identify what the root cause of those emotions are, or what the root cause of your overeating is. Then number two, you're going to identify those trigger points, what triggers the overeating. Number three, you're going to work on different scenarios and different habits and actions that you can turn to in that moment when you are triggered. At the end of the day, it's all about breaking that habit loop. And the only way you're going to do that is by actually starting to implement this if-then strategy.